everyone, and welcome to this week's Webinar Wednesday. I'm Catherine Irwin, Speaker Coordinator here at the MRC. Today's webinar is What Merchants Need to Know About PCI DSS v4.0 with MRC members TokenEx. Before we dive into today's session, I'd like to provide a brief overview of the Merchant Risk Council and the services we provide. The MRC is a global nonprofit membership association for payments and fraud prevention professionals. We were established more than 20 years ago by a group of merchants interested in developing merchant-focused resources. Currently, we support over 650 member companies, including merchants, solution providers, law enforcement groups, and advisory service organizations across 30 countries, and we're still growing. In addition to webinars like this one, you can attend MRC events, both online and in person, explore our massive content library in the Resource Center, and sign up for the MRC newsletter, Commerce Corner, to stay ahead of all the latest industry news and trends. MRC members also have access to member-exclusive content, discussion forums, educational programs, discounted rates for conferences and events, and plenty more. To learn more about who we are or how you can benefit by joining, visit the MRC website at merchantriskcouncil.org. Okay, back to today's session. Please make sure to use the Q&A panel to the right-hand side of your screen to ask any questions you might have. And at the end of this webinar, we'll do our best to answer them. Now I'd like to turn it over to John at TokenEx. John?
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks everybody for joining me this afternoon or evening if you're listening to this live. Today we're going to talk about what merchants need to know about PCI DSS version 4.0. As Catherine mentioned, my name is John Noltensmeyer. I'm the CISO and Data Protection Officer for TokenEx. TokenEx is a cloud-based token service provider. We were founded by two former QSAs almost 12 years ago, so we've been around about half as long as the MRC. Over that time, we've had the opportunity to help hundreds of clients minimize their PCI DSS scope and the corresponding risk that comes with storing, transmitting, and processing cardholder data. A little bit about the agenda for today. So we're going to start with just a very quick overview of the PCI DSS. This is not going to be an in-depth primer on the PCI DSS generally, but just kind of a quick level set to make sure that we all understand why there's a new version of the PCI DSS and kind of how we got to this point. We're going to talk about the transition timeline from version 3.2.1 to version 4. We'll also talk about just kind of a high-level overview of the changes in the PCI DSS version 4. And then we're going to talk about 6 key new requirements in version 4 that are be applicable to a significant number of merchants. And we'll follow that with some broad suggestions on how to prepare for a PCI DSS version 4 assessment. And then we'll cover some resources that are available to you to help you as you get ready for that initial assessment and to ensure your ongoing compliance. So the payment card industry data security standard, as its name implies, is a baseline or minimum technical and operational standard for protecting cardholder data. It was developed by the major card brands, American Express, Discover, MasterCard, JCB, and Visa, to reduce breaches of cardholder data and the resulting fraud from those breaches. As I mentioned, it's a baseline or minimum standard. So you can think of the requirements in the PCI DSS as information security pieces of flair, right? You can do the bare minimum, or you can do more to ensure the security of that data. So as I mentioned, of course, the card brands are focused on cardholder data itself, cardholder account data, but it is a baseline data security standard, so it's applicable really to any sensitive data within your organization. So a lot of cardholder data, things like names and cardholders' street addresses, right? That data is now covered by one or more data protection laws, either regional laws, local laws, or in some cases, national laws or international laws, even like the GDPR in Europe. So the PCI DSS is applicable to any entity that is involved in the processing, essentially, of cardholder data. So even if you've outsourced all the storing, the transmitting, and the technical processing of cardholder data to a third-party service provider like TokenEx or your payment service provider, there are some PCI DSS requirements that will apply to you. So it's kind of highlighted on this slide that use of a PCI compliant third-party service provider, or TPSP, doesn't remove your ultimate responsibility for PCI DSS compliance. So if you happen to talk to a service provider that says they can shoulder all of that responsibility, or you no longer need to worry about PCI DSS compliance because you're using their services, you should rapidly look elsewhere for somebody else that can help you meet your compliance requirements. The original, or the version 1 of the PCI DSS, was released in December 2004. The last release, 3.2.1, the one that's currently in effect, well, both 3.2.1 and version 4 are now in effect, but 3.2.1 was released in 2018, so five years ago. The original version or version 3 rather, was released 10 years ago, so it'd been quite some time since we had a new update. So that's part of the reason that version 4 is as significant as it is, because again, there's been 5 years since that last significant revision of the data security standard. So now we'll talk a little bit about the timeline. So as I mentioned, version 4 is available, and if you wanted to assess your environment using version 4 today, you could do so. 3.2.1 is also currently in effect. So version 4 has been released along with training for ISAs, internal security assessors, and QSAs. So there's lots of documentation, lots of good information out there if you have not really started looking at how to comply with version 4. As you can see from the timeline on this slide, we're kind of midway in the implementation of all requirements. So there's two really significant dates that you need to be aware of or keep on your calendar in terms of when to be compliant. So the first of those dates is March 31st of next year. So we're roughly 3 quarters away from that date. That is when version 3.2.1 is officially retired, and only version 4 will be effective. So any assessments conducted after March 31st of next year will be against version 4 of the PCI DSS. The reason there's 2 dates is because this is such a significant update from 3.2.1. There are a number of changes in technical requirements, and the Security Standards Council felt that it was prudent to give merchants and entities that are subject to PCI DSS compliance some additional time to comply with those requirements. So if you haven't begun the process of becoming compliant of technical changes, so it's likely that in order to be compliant with version 4, even if you're compliant with 3.2.1 today, there are going to be, it's going to require some significant changes to your existing information security or compliance programs. So just a quick overview of the changes within the PCI DSS. So it's kind of a high level description of what the goals were and why we have a new version. So it's been updated to reflect both changes in technology as well as the threats that we all face, particularly if you're an e-commerce merchant. So 3.2.1, for example, doesn't mention or contain the word cloud. It's in version 4 over 40 times. There's also a requirement broadly, you'll see it multiple times throughout version 4, to clearly assign and document roles and responsibilities for compliance with all the requirements. And also, version 4 reflects the need for flexibility in achieving the security measures. This is called the customized approach. So you may be familiar with compensating control is different than compensating controls in the sense that their compensating controls were used when a merchant or other organization had a constraint that they couldn't meet one of the requirements. An example that's often used is password length, for example. So you may have had a legacy system and you couldn't change the password length in that system. So you would implement a compensating control. In contrast to that, the customized approach allows a merchant to define the way in which they're going to meet the requirements. So it's not that there's a constraint preventing them, but it's a customized way to meet the requirement, the stated requirement. Throughout the version 4, there is mention of a targeted risk analysis for establishing the frequency of certain activities. This really puts the onus, or maybe to phrase in a more positive light, it allows the merchant to set the frequency of some of the activities that they use to comply with the requirements. So a merchant would have to demonstrate through a risk analysis that the activity, the frequency with which they're going to engage in this activity is sufficient in order to meet the intent of the requirement. But a risk analysis and the corresponding documentation is mentioned several times in version 4. And you've heard me say documentation and more documentation is a big part of version 4. In 3.2.1, where it was, you may have been able to check a box noting that you're compliant. Version 4 is very specific about documentation that you're going to need to have on hand to demonstrate your compliance with all of the various requirements. So there is a document, if you haven't seen it, that the Security Standards Council has produced. So it's a summary of changes from 3.2.1 to version 4. There's two sections in particular that I find particularly valuable. So section 5 has all of the changes per requirement. So if you look at the snippet that's contained on the screen, you can see for requirement 1, for example, what requirement in 3.2.1, how that translates to version 4, and what changes were made. So in looking at the description of the change that's captured here, you'll see that in requirement 1, firewalls and routers were replaced with network security controls. This is obviously an example of changes in technology that I referenced that is contained more broadly throughout PCI DSS version 4. So there's no longer references to maintaining and installing a firewall. Rather, we're just talking about network security controls more broadly. The other section of this document that I think is particularly valuable is section 6. So this specifically lists all the new requirements in version 4. So these are requirements that were not contained in 3.2.1. There are 64 of them. Not all of them are applicable to merchants. So as you can see on this particular slide, there's an applicability column. So all entities obviously would include merchants, and some of these requirements impact service providers only. Most importantly, or perhaps also importantly, there's an effective date column. So you can see which of these requirements are immediately effective. So if your next PCI assessment is in April of next year, you would be subject to this requirement, or this requirement would be applicable during your assessments. And you can see those future dated requirements in the March 31st column. So of those 64, there are 6 requirements that we're going to focus on today. And those 6 requirements were selected, or I selected them, either because they're going to be broadly applicable, so most merchants will be subjected to them, or in order to meet the requirements to be compliant, it's going to require some time and possibly significant changes to your information security program. I'm not going to read these 6 because we're about to go through each of them in detail, but as I mentioned, they are, a number of them, broadly applicable to merchants. So 4 of those 6 are included in the SAQA. So I'm sure that you're very familiar with an SAQA, but just in case, an SAQA, a self-assessment questionnaire, is applicable to merchants who accept only card not present transactions. So that'd be e-commerce or MOTO, mail order, telephone order. And they've outsourced all the processing of account data to a third-party PCI compliant service provider. Again, that might be your payment processor or a tokenization provider. And the merchant does not therefore store, process, or transmit any cardholder account data. Now, again, this does not mean that the merchant doesn't have any obligations under the PCI DSS, but you'll see here 2 examples of 2 of these 6 new requirements, and it's specifically the highlighted sections note that these requirements, even if the merchant has outsourced or is using a third-party service provider to provide an e-commerce page, for example, or an iframe, these requirements are still applicable. That merchant in the past, where they wouldn't have had to worry about requirements like this in their assessment under 3.2.1, will now have obligations to ensure the security of these pages. And we'll get into the details of these 2 requirements a little bit further on. So the first requirement has to do with that we're going to cover in depth, has to do with the processing of sensitive account data. So just kind of an overview or review, hopefully. Payment account data is comprised of cardholder data, which includes the PAN or primary account number, the cardholder name, expiration date, and service code, versus sensitive authentication data, or SAD. So SAD is full track data that was contained in the magnetic stripe, it still is in some cases, the card verification code, so CVV, for example, and pins and pin blocks. In the case of cardholder data, the PAN is the defining factor of whether or not something is cardholder data. So if you tokenized a PAN, the rest of that information, the cardholder name and expiration date, effectively ceases to become cardholder data. So it wouldn't be subject anymore to the PCI DSS, the data requirements specifically. So that's why tokenization, for example, can reduce this PCI compliant scope of merchants, because in effect, if they've tokenized all the PANs, then they no longer have cardholder data in their environment. On the other hand, sensitive authentication data is always sensitive authentication data. So the reason I'm stressing this is in my time in payments, and particularly at TokenEx, this has come up multiple times with some of our clients about whether or not SAD is still considered sensitive authentication data in absence of the PAN. And the argument that I've heard numerous times is essentially, a 3 or 4 digit numeric number really has no value in the absence of the PAN. That argument turns out is incorrect, and it's explicitly stated now in version 4. So it applies to all storage of sensitive authentication data, even if the PAN is not present. So previously under 3.2.1, you could store sensitive authentication data unencrypted. If you are storing SAD prior to authentication, under version 4, that data must now be encrypted. So this obviously would not be applicable to an SAQA merchant, but for anybody who does have a cardholder data environment, now you must be encrypting that data. As you can see highlighted on the slide, this is one of those requirements that is future dated until March of 2025. One other thing to note on this slide is that no one is allowed, other than issuers effectively, to store sensitive authentication data post the authorization process. So this is another thing that's come up in the past when we have had discussions with some of our merchant clients. Sometimes there's a feeling that if the authorization fails, then it's okay to retain the SAD and try that authorization later or with a different processor. You can see documented here that the authorization process takes place once a response is received, whether that operation was approved or not. The next requirement that we'll talk about is protection against phishing attacks. So this is a requirement that is included in the SAQA. So obviously, phishing, hopefully everybody knows, is a form of social engineering. So typically, it's an email sent impersonating someone else in an effort to trick the recipient into clicking on a link or sharing sensitive information. This is the primary vector for distribution of malware and ransomware attacks. So this is why it's included in the PCI DSS 4. Again, an example of kind of the change in threats that we're all subject to. TokenEx gets phishing attempts on a daily basis. We're not even that large of an organization, so the requirement here is that there's an automated phishing protection mechanism. So an automated mechanism, right, will limit opportunities for your employees or people you work with to click on links or potentially fall victim of a phishing attack. It is worth noting that this requirement, right, doesn't bring your email system into scope, and it is only applicable to individuals that have access to your cardholder data environment or basically are part of your card processing. But this is obviously something that you should enforce across an entire organization. The next requirement that we're going to talk about is managing all payment page scripts, JavaScript that runs on your e-commerce payment page. So this one is getting a little bit more involved. And again, this is part of an SAQA. It's one of the two requirements that I showed earlier, that even if you're outsource all of your processing of cardholder data to a third-party service provider, you still have some obligations under this particular requirement. So kind of going from the bottom to top here, you have to maintain an inventory of all the scripts that run on your page, as well as ensure that the integrity of each script, so that the script cannot be modified, and also confirm that script should be running. So if it's a malicious script, it does no good to validate or ensure that it hasn't been modified. You just don't want that script running on your page at all. So the reason that this is included in version 4 is this continues to be, especially with the shift of fraud online now that EMV chips have become fairly ubiquitous in terms of card presence, right? Payment pages are the primary fraud vector now, and it's possible with a malicious script loaded on a page to conduct an overlay attack. So, for example, on this slide, you see an input field where a card holder would enter their card number as well as their CVV. So in an overlay attack, there's essentially an iframe or inputs on top of the fields that you intended for the card holder to enter their information in, and the attacker captures that information directly. So the difficulty with complying with this requirement is that scripts are dynamic. They change frequently. So TokenEx has an iframe solution, for example, that requires a JavaScript library our clients to implement that as part of their payments page. And we do make changes to that JavaScript as we add new features and functionality. Scripts can also call other scripts. So you can see at the top of this page that this requirement applies to all scripts loaded from the merchant's environment, as well as third-party scripts from a service provider, for example, as well as fourth parties. So if the script on your page calls another script, you need to ensure that that script is authorized, it should be running, and that it has not been tampered with. This requirement is future dated to March of 2025, because I think it's going to be difficult for a lot of merchants to effectively comply. This is one of those requirements that's going to take time and will require most likely a change to processes that you had in existence or would have had in existence just to comply with version 3.2.1. So you could attempt to do this manually. The average web page, you see different numbers depending upon the source, but a recent number I saw is that the average e-commerce checkout page has 37 scripts on it. I actually think that's a low number, but to manually keep track of those scripts and whether or not they have changed, as well as whether or not they're reaching out and calling another script, I think is going to be difficult for a lot of merchants. So there are service providers out there. Human is just one example. So Human Security has a product called Code Defender, and the reason I'm mentioning it here is just because it fits nicely. Their interface fits nicely on one slide. You can see, and it addresses not only this particular requirement, but another one we're going to talk about in a little bit, 11.6.1. But you can see on this slide that it satisfies all the elements of this requirement. So it compiles a list of all the scripts on the page. You can, from this particular screen, authorize or block the script, and you can detect, it'll show you any changes that have been made. The next requirement we're going to talk about is 8.3.6. So all passwords must now be at least 12 characters. Going back to minimum pieces of flair. This is only applicable to users and administrators that potentially are dealing with cardholder data. However, this is something that you should be applying wherever possible across your environment. And obviously, the longer a password is, the more secure, or the better protection that it's going to offer. So if you use something like a passphrase, right, a phrase is going to be easier to remember and longer, and therefore harder for somebody to guess or crack. So this is, again, a future dated requirement that you won't have to comply with until March of 2025. The next requirement we're going to talk about is 11.3.1.2. So internal vulnerability scans must be authenticated. Again, this is also part of this AQA, also a future dated requirement. When you run a vulnerability scan to look for vulnerabilities, open ports, for example, that don't need to be open, or unpatched systems, an authenticated scan will generally provide you with much more detailed and accurate information than an unauthenticated scan. So this is not a new requirement in the sense that there's always been a requirement to perform vulnerability scanning, but now the nuance here, the addition here is the authentication that must be performed. So it's worth noting that if you're scanning a system that is unable to accept credentials while you're authenticating, again, you've got to document those systems. What's captured on the screen here is just an example, in this case from Nessus, a common vulnerability scanner. And this is where you would enter the authentication credentials to use during scanning. Obviously, if you want to treat these credentials as sensitive information and make sure that they don't, nobody has access to them outside of this particular use. The next requirement we're going to talk about is 11.6.1. This is very similar to the requirement earlier to inventory or ensure that all the scripts on your page are authorized. So the intent here similarly is to detect any changes that have been made to HTTP headers and the payment page itself, right? So if an attacker is able to modify the page or to change HTTP headers that ultimately reach the cardholder's browser, there's going to be an opportunity for them to potentially steal the cardholder data. So if you can implement a method to detect those changes, right, you would know that there's been a skimming attack has implemented on your page. You'll see highlighted here by the red arrow that it is possible to do this manually. But I think the council recognizes that there's going to be some difficulty for given the complexity of most checkout pages. It's going to be difficult to do this using a manual or custom method, and it's likely going to require a solution like the one I mentioned earlier. The last of the 6 requirements that we're going to talk about in detail is 12.5.2. So this is new this is new at the merchant level. If you're a service provider, if you're a level 1 merchant or a level 1 service provider, and you're going through a full PCI DSS audit, right? The scoping, you're very familiar with the scoping exercise. So this is not going to be applicable to merchants that have completely outsourced all the processing of their cardholder data. But if you do have a CDE and you're a merchant of any size at this point, you're going to have to verify or document your PCI scope at least once every 12 months or upon significant change. So this includes identifying the data flows in your environment, as well as documenting where that data is stored, how it's protected. So, and just when you thought, we've made it and all these requirements were future dated, this requirement is effective immediately for all version 4 assessments. In addition, this activity is to be performed internally. It's separate from the scoping exercise that is done by your QSA. So it is again, it wouldn't be applicable to someone like an SAQA merchant, but you would go through a process of identifying all the cardholder data flows in the organization, which would include all locations where the account data is stored, processed, transmitted. You'd want to identify all segmentation controls that you're using for the CDE to create the CDE, as well as identify anything that impacts, right, the security of that CDE, as well as any connections to third parties that have access to the CDE. I mentioned as well, you want to document how that data is being protected. So types of encryption, the strength, whether you're hashing that data. And then you're also going to need to document how access of that data is being logged. So those are the 6 requirements that I think in particular are going to impact the most number of merchants, simply because 4 of them are included on SAQA, and a couple of them processing or encrypting SAD before it is processed, as well as the in-scope validation. There's some significant impacts of this just based on compliance versus version 3.2.1. Talk a little bit about just how to prepare for PCI DSS version 4 compliance generally. So if you have not taken a look at version 4 in detail, now is the time to do so, to understand all the changes between 3.2.1 and version 4. So the document that I highlighted earlier from the PCI Security Standards Council is a great place to start if you haven't already looked at it. Again, it shows you all the changes requirement by requirements, as well as it has a concise list of all the new requirements. After you do that, and you determine which of the requirements apply to your organization and your environment, the next step would be to perform a gap assessment and determine, which of the new requirements will be applicable in your version 4 assessment, and then assign roles and responsibilities for those requirements. And that would include documentation, updating any processes and procedures in order to demonstrate the fact that you are compliant with those new requirements. Now I would suggest performing a pre-assessment prior to your formal version 4 assessment. So this would be an opportunity to determine how prepared you are and to identify any missing documentation or evidence before you get to your actual formal version 4 assessment. So there's, some of these things some of these requirements necessitate gathering evidence over time. So if you don't have them in place prior to the formal assessment, you may have some difficulty in demonstrating your compliance. Just some general compliance tips. Don't put preparation off any longer than you already have if you haven't yet started. So as I mentioned multiple times, there's likely to be some changes to your internal security program or your compliance program, and those things will take time. And as you're undoubtedly aware, if you have to rush something or hurry something, sometimes that ends up costing your organization money that it wouldn't if you prepared in advance and had the time to take the appropriate steps to comply. In addition, you want to ensure that any third-party service providers you use are maintaining their own PCI compliance. So we're in a transition period here where every organization that is subject to a PCI DSS assessment, is going to be going through the same thing you are, moving from 3.2.1 to version 4. Ultimately, as a merchant, you're responsible for your own compliance. So even though you've outsourced or you're using a PCI compliant third party, you're ultimately responsible for compliance and ensuring that third party is both maintaining their compliance and ultimately doing what is expected of them. So along this way, at least annually, check and ensure that all your third-party service providers have maintained their compliance. And it's easy to think of PCI as this annual point in time thing. So you've got your annual assessment coming up, and as soon as it ends, everybody's happy. They breathe a sigh of relief and kind of put off thinking about it again as long as possible. Ultimately, compliance is not a point in time exercise, right? There's mentioned multiple times in version 4 of continuous compliance, and that's why a number of these requirements will contain sub-requirements that talk about how often or how frequently you need to perform validation or capture evidence to demonstrate your compliance. The importance of this really is illustrated on this slide. So Verizon every year, not every year, every other year puts out a payment security report. So this is a report from 2022. And what's captured on this slide is compliance trends. So this is an interim validation. So between the formal annual assessments, Verizon did a survey, and you can see the level of compliance here. Fortunately, in 2020, there was a bit of an uptick, but you can still see that compliance in between assessments is below 50%. So, organizations change, particularly technologies. It's very easy for systems, processes, procedures you had in place during your formal assessment. Those systems can change throughout the year, and sometimes the policies, procedures lag, or you add new functionality or new partners, new service providers, and sort of forget to include them in your PCI DSS compliance until your next formal audit. So it's important as you move throughout the year to think about compliance as a continuing obligation, and make it part of your business as usual practices. So I mentioned a number of different documents that during our discussion, I've noted a number of them here, and we will make this slide deck available. You'll get an email after the webinar if you want this list or any of the other information. So most of the PCI Security Standard Council documents, I shouldn't say most, all of them are available on the Security Standard Council website under the Resource Hub. There's under the Document Library. The first link on this page is a Resource Hub that has a number of resources specific to version 4. So they include non-official documents, so things like blog posts, FAQs, webcasts that talk about version 4 compliance and the transition from 3.2 to version 4. The document library will have the version 4 of the PCI DSS, as well as the summary of changes document. Again, I think that's one of the more valuable documents that the council has created as you look at doing a gap assessment from 3.2.1 to version 4. They have a best practices document for maintaining compliance, again, sort of ensuring that your PCI DSS compliance is part of your business as usual processes as you move throughout the year. There's also the information supplement on guidance for PCI DSS scoping and network segmentation. So the last requirement that we talked about, the one that now obligates merchants that have a CDE, merchants of any size, in order to go through an annual scoping exercise. This document is particularly helpful if you have not done that before. So it will help you or give you a good idea of what is in scope, and therefore, what is part of your PCI DSS assessments, and how segmentation works, methods for segmentation. So it's a valuable document if you have never done a scoping exercise firsthand. There's also the prioritized approach for PCI DSS compliance. So this document may or may not be useful depending upon sort of the maturity of your compliance program, but it does break out all the requirements, have a list of all the requirements, and essentially a priority in terms of addressing each of the requirements. So if you have a nascent program, or again, you're just now looking at PCI DSS version 4 compliance, the prioritized approach would be a good place to start. I mentioned the Verizon Payment Security Report. Verizon has a couple of other reports that are particularly useful when you think about, as you think about the security of the cardholder data and really any sensitive data in your environment. If you haven't seen these reports, it's worth trading your personal data to Verizon to view these reports. If it's Verizon, they probably have your personal data already. But these reports really do contain some valuable information, so you can see really what the top threats are to your environment and the data within your environment, as well as the payment security insights does have some good information about how to approach compliance generally. So again, depending upon the maturity of your compliance and IT security programs, you may find that document more or less useful. Worst case scenario would just confirm for you that you're doing a number of things right. And the data breach investigations report. This is a great report. That it's not specific to payments. It's more about data breaches generally, but it does give you a very good picture of what the threats are your environment that you're likely facing, and how other organizations are being impacted. So that is the end of the formal presentation portion of the webinar. As I mentioned, you will get an email that will have a link to download this slide. It will also give you information on how, if you're interested in receiving a 30-minute PCI consultation with myself or a member of our solutions architecture team, all of whom are ISAs. We're happy to consult with you. Again, we'll do that for free, whether or not you're using TokenEx or ever plan to use TokenEx. It's, again, we've had the benefit of working with hundreds of clients on their PCI security, and it makes us good netizens to share that information. And again, we're all sort of on this journey of version 4 compliance together. So with that, I'd love to answer any questions that anybody has, and thank you again for sharing a portion of your day with me.
Hey, John, this has been incredibly informative. Thank you so much. And we do have some questions coming in. Let's see, the first one. We work with a QSA firm. Will they address these new requirements for us?
Right. So the QSAs are there to assess your environment. Now, it's likely, depending upon your arrangement, that they also perform. I mean, it could be a very consultative arrangement. So you may, if you haven't already, reach out to them and talk about, version 4. They may be willing to do a gap assessment with you, talk about areas that they think are going to be a particular focus, particularly if they've done an assessment of your environment before. But ultimately, they're assessing your environment. You as the merchants are ultimately responsible for your compliance with PCI DSS. So they're not going to do any of these things for you. They may have recommendations, and again, likely to be a resource, but I wouldn't expect your QSA company to shoulder any of these obligations for you.
Okay. Can you touch on SAD data in more detail? Does this include the CVV? How best can one protect SAD data for an assessment?
Yeah, so it does include the CVV, and that's typically what it is. So, historically, at least in terms of my experience, we had a lot of clients that would tokenize the PAN, but sometimes based on advice they received elsewhere, they would store the sensitive authentication data, or CVV, in their environments with the tokenized data, thinking that they were compliant with the PCI DSS. That's certainly not going to be the case under version 4. So if you store that data, technically you're storing cardholder account data. So certainly would encourage you not to do that if you're a merchant that qualifies for an SAQA, for example, because effectively by storing that data before authentication, storing the CVV before that initial authentication, you've just created a CDE, or cardholder data environment, and anything that stores, transmits, or processes that CVV is effectively in scope for the PCI DSS. So, I mean, an obvious way to protect that data is, if you are tokenizing the PAN, you can tokenize the CVV as well. Don't store the actual CVV. The new requirement under version 4 is if you are storing the CVV, you must encrypt that data.
Okay, let's see. It looks like we have one more question that's come in. What costs should organizations be aware of in addressing 4.0?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the answer is it will depend based on the complexity of your environment and how quickly you prepare. So I mentioned that if you start preparing now and ahead of time, you're likely not to have unanticipated costs along the way. So some of these requirements, for example, tracking all the scripts on your payment page or making sure that the HTTP headers are not modified, those might cost you, there may be a cost to the organization if you use a third party to provide that solution. So you're likely to certainly incur some costs in terms of internal resources as you make adjustments to your internal security and compliance programs. So, for smaller merchants or merchants that are e-commerce only and have outsourced all of their payment processing to a third party, they're likely to be less cost than somebody who is, a merchant that has to do a full PCI assessment or is validating against an SAQD.
All right, John, that looks like it was the last question. Do you have any final words?
Just thanks again. And if you have any questions, you certainly find me on LinkedIn, or you'll receive an email as a follow-up to this, but certainly enjoyed the opportunity to share what I think are the most important, or certainly 6 of the key requirements that are coming in version 4. And I look forward to the next MRC webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. And thanks to everybody who attended, and especially those who submitted some questions. I'd like to go ahead and say have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you at the next webinar Wednesday. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.